He thought one careless joke would entertain an entire restaurant, but within the next 30 minutes, the meal resting on his own tasting counter would force him to question everything he believed about talent, success, and the people he judged by appearance. Chef Michael Prescott stood perfectly still beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, his tasting fork frozen halfway between the porcelain plate and his lips. Around him, the elegant dining room had become so quiet that even the faint bubbling of butter from the open kitchen seemed unusually loud. More than 100 guests watched without speaking. His brigade of chefs stared from behind polished stainless steel counters. A respected food critic waited patiently with folded hands, her experienced eyes fixed on the dish before him. Michael had tasted thousands of meals throughout his career. He could usually identify an inexperienced cook after a single bite. Tonight was different. The crisp skin shattered with delicate precision before giving way to tender, perfectly cooked fish. Bright citrus balanced rich brown butter without overpowering it. Fresh herbs elevated every ingredient instead of competing for attention. Nothing felt excessive. Nothing felt accidental. Every flavor arrived exactly when it should and disappeared at precisely the right moment. Michael slowly lowered his fork. His confident smile faded almost imperceptibly. This was not luck. This was not instinct alone. This was mastery. He looked toward the quiet woman standing several feet away, wearing faded blue jeans, a plain white button-up shirt, and comfortable sneakers still carrying traces of soil from a family farm. She stood with relaxed shoulders, her chestnut hair tied into a simple low ponytail, neither smiling nor searching the room for approval. She simply waited with calm patience, as though the outcome had never been in doubt. Michael searched desperately for a flaw, some small mistake that would restore the certainty he had carried into the evening. He found none. Before anyone could speak, the story truly began 30 minutes earlier, when the restaurant had been alive with laughter instead of silence. Harrington House had become one of Chicago's most sought-after dining destinations, famous for elegant seasonal menus, flawless service, and Chef Michael Prescott's charismatic personality. Guests traveled from across the country to experience his celebrated tasting menu. Food magazines praised his creativity. Television programs showcased his kitchen. Young chefs dreamed of working under his leadership. Success had rewarded him generously, but over the years it had quietly convinced him that greatness always arrived dressed in expensive jackets, polished shoes, and impressive resumes. That Saturday evening every table had been reserved weeks in advance. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath soft golden lights while servers moved gracefully between elegantly dressed guests. Inside the open kitchen, cooks worked with disciplined precision, answering Michael's commands without hesitation. At exactly 6:15 in the evening, the rear service entrance opened. Emily Carter stepped inside carrying 2 reusable crates filled with freshly harvested rosemary, thyme, basil, heirloom tomatoes, and seasonal vegetables from her cousin's nearby farm. She greeted the receiving clerk with a warm smile before placing each crate carefully onto the prep counter. At 39 years old, Emily appeared completely ordinary. Her clothes were practical rather than fashionable. Her hands carried the faint marks of years spent working outdoors. Most employees barely noticed her arrival. Those who did assumed she was simply another local supplier making a routine delivery before dinner service reached its busiest hour. Emily quietly began organizing the herbs exactly as requested. As she passed the sauté station, she paused for only a brief moment. A faint aroma drifted from one of the pans. It was subtle enough that almost no one noticed, but her expression changed ever so slightly. She recognized the unmistakable scent of butter that had remained over the heat just a little too long, and without realizing it, that single quiet observation was about to change every life inside the restaurant. Emily quietly reached toward the sauté station where a young line cook was finishing the restaurant's signature lemon butter sauce. She did not interrupt him. She simply leaned in slightly and lowered her voice enough that only he could hear. "The butter stayed over the heat a few seconds too long," she said gently. "If you add the wine now, it may carry a faint bitter note." The young cook blinked in surprise. He instinctively glanced down at the pan, uncertain whether to trust the observation of someone who had arrived carrying vegetable crates instead of wearing a chef's jacket. Before he could respond, Chef Michael Prescott turned from the pass after plating another entree. "Is there a problem over there?" he called confidently. The young cook hesitated before answering. She just mentioned something about the butter, chef. Michael slowly walked toward them, wiping his hands on a spotless white kitchen towel. His polished black shoes echoed softly across the tile floor while nearby cooks pretended to stay busy, though every ear was suddenly listening. The butter, Michael repeated with an amused smile. And who exactly offered that professional opinion? The young cook gestured awkwardly toward Emily. Michael looked her up and down without attempting to hide his skepticism. Her faded jeans, simple white shirt, and reusable produce crates hardly matched the image of someone qualified to critique one of Chicago's most respected kitchens. Emily met his gaze calmly. I only thought the flavor might become slightly bitter if it stayed on the burner too long, she explained politely. Michael glanced at the pan before lifting a spoon for himself. He tasted the sauce without any visible reaction, then looked back at Emily with a confident smile. It tastes exactly as intended. Several cooks chuckled quietly. Emily nodded with complete respect. Then I am glad to hear that. She reached for another bundle of fresh thyme and continued arranging herbs as though the conversation had already ended. Michael should have walked away. Instead, something about her composure unsettled him. Most people who question his work quickly apologized or tried to defend themselves. Emily did neither. She simply accepted his response without argument, and somehow that quiet confidence irritated him more than open disagreement ever could. Just then, the maitre d' entered the kitchen carrying a reservation list. Chef, he said, Miss Eleanor Whitman has arrived. A subtle wave of attention swept through the brigade. Eleanor Whitman was one of the country's most respected food critics. Her reviews could transform an unknown restaurant into a national destination, or quietly expose weaknesses beneath expensive decorations. Michael smiled immediately. Perfect timing, he replied. Tonight she will experience the finest service we have ever delivered. He adjusted his jacket and gave a few final instructions before returning to the line. Emily continued unloading vegetables without saying another word. As another pan heated nearby, she once again noticed the same faint aroma beginning to develop beneath the butter. She looked toward the young cook, who now caught her eye almost instinctively. This time, before the butter darkened, he reduced the heat slightly. The smell immediately softened. He stared into the pan with growing surprise before tasting the sauce himself. His eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. The bitterness had disappeared. He looked toward Emily across the kitchen. She simply smiled and continued placing fresh basil into a container as though nothing remarkable had happened. The young cook never mentioned what he had discovered, but someone else had been watching the entire exchange. Chef Michael Prescott had noticed the adjustment from across the kitchen, and although he refused to admit it even to himself, the smallest crack had begun to appear in the certainty that had defined his reputation for years. Pride rarely accepts doubt gracefully, and before the evening ended, Michael would make a decision driven far more by ego than by wisdom. Michael watched Emily from the opposite side of the kitchen, while pretending to inspect a row of freshly plated entrees. His expression remained confident, but his thoughts had become unexpectedly unsettled. The young line cook had adjusted the butter exactly as the woman suggested, and the improvement had been impossible to ignore. Michael refused to believe it meant anything. One correct observation did not make someone a chef. It certainly did not give a produce supplier the right to question his kitchen. Pride quietly searched for a way to restore the balance he believed had been disturbed. Across the dining room, Eleanor Whitman settled into the chef's table with a notebook resting beside her water glass. She never rushed through a meal. She watched every movement inside the open kitchen with the patience of someone who understood that great restaurants revealed themselves long before the first plate reached the table. Michael noticed her calm attention and suddenly realized that every pair of eyes in the restaurant would soon be focused on him. An idea formed almost instantly. If the quiet woman believed she understood cooking well enough to offer advice, perhaps she should have the opportunity to prove it. He smiled, not with warmth but with confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced loud enough for nearby guests to hear. One of the wonderful things about food is that everyone believes they know how to cook. Several diners laughed politely. Emily slowly looked up from organizing fresh herbs. Michael continued. Tonight we have someone who was kind enough to offer professional advice to my kitchen. I think it would only be fair to let her demonstrate those skills." Curious whispers spread through the dining room. A few guests turned in their chairs. Others lifted their phones with quiet excitement. Emily remained completely still. "I only shared an observation," she answered respectfully. "I was not trying to interrupt your work." Michael spread his hands with theatrical confidence. "Exactly. And observations usually come from experience. Surely you would not mind preparing a simple dish for us." More laughter drifted through the room. Several members of the kitchen brigade exchanged uncomfortable glances. One dishwasher quietly lowered his eyes. The young line cook who had followed Emily's advice looked as though he wanted to say something but remained silent. Michael stepped closer. "Do not worry," he continued. "We will not make it difficult. Use whatever ingredients are already here. 30 minutes should be more than enough." Emily looked around the restaurant. She saw smiling faces expecting entertainment rather than excellence. She noticed cameras pointed toward her. She recognized that refusing would only confirm every assumption already being made about her. Yet there was no anger in her expression. No embarrassment. Only thoughtful silence. Finally she nodded once. "If you truly wish for me to cook," she replied softly, "I will prepare something with gratitude for the ingredients you have provided." Her calm acceptance unexpectedly removed much of the amusement from the room. Michael handed her a clean apron with a satisfied smile, convinced the evening was unfolding exactly as he intended. "Excellent," he said. "Perhaps our guests will discover that confidence tastes even better than curiosity." Emily accepted the apron politely but did not put it on immediately. Instead she carefully folded the sleeves of her white shirt, tied back the loose strand of chestnut hair that had fallen beside her face, and quietly washed her hands at the stainless steel sink. Every movement carried remarkable discipline. Without realizing why, the conversations throughout the dining room gradually became quieter. Somewhere deep inside the kitchen, anticipation had quietly replaced laughter, and although Michael still believed he was about to entertain his guests, the first invisible step toward his own humbling had already begun. Emily tied the apron neatly around her waist and stepped toward the preparation counter without the slightest trace of hesitation. She did not reach immediately for a knife or a pan. Instead, she quietly surveyed the kitchen, allowing her eyes to travel from the refrigerated drawers to the spice rack, from the sauté station to the cutting boards, and finally to the burners themselves. To everyone else, it appeared as though she was uncertain where to begin. Michael smiled to himself. The silence confirmed exactly what he expected. "Need a little help figuring out where everything is?" he asked with a grin that drew another round of laughter from several nearby guests. Emily looked toward him with complete courtesy. "No, thank you," she answered softly. "I am simply getting to know your kitchen." Michael folded his arms. 30 minutes is passing quickly." She nodded once. "Good food begins before the first ingredient touches the pan." Her answer was calm, neither defensive nor boastful. Several cooks exchanged puzzled glances. Michael dismissed the comment with a shrug and turned toward his brigade. "Let us make this a little more interesting," he announced. "She may use only the ingredients already prepared for tonight's service. No additional supplies. No special requests. And she will work alone." A few guests applauded, believing the challenge added excitement to the evening. One young sous chef stepped forward cautiously. "Chef, perhaps we should at least let her choose another cutting board. That one has already been used for seafood." Michael shook his head before the sentence could finish. Professional kitchens demand adaptability. The young sous chef reluctantly stepped back. Emily quietly reached for a clean sanitized board stored beneath the counter instead. She smiled politely toward the young cook without saying a word. The small decision did not escape Eleanor Whitman's attention. Seated only a few feet away, the veteran food critic continued observing with remarkable focus. She wrote a brief note inside her notebook before closing it again. Emily opened the refrigerator and examined each shelf with remarkable patience. Expensive imported truffles rested beside premium Wagyu beef. Fresh lobster had been prepared for the evening's tasting menu. She passed every luxury ingredient without touching them. Instead, she selected a fresh sea base, several stalks of asparagus, heirloom tomatoes, shallots, rosemary, thyme, basil, butter, 1 lemon, and a small bottle of white wine already chilling beside the seafood station. Michael watched with quiet amusement. "Interesting choices," he remarked. "Most people reach for the most expensive ingredients when they want to impress." Emily gently placed the sea base on the counter. "Ingredients do not become extraordinary because they cost more," she replied. "They become extraordinary when someone respects what they already are." A few members of the brigade looked at one another in thoughtful silence. The words sounded less like philosophy and more like something learned through years of experience. Emily arranged every ingredient in perfect order. Before lifting a chef's knife from the magnetic rack, she tested its balance for only a second before setting it back and selecting another one beside it. The second knife fit her hand naturally. The older prep cook standing nearby raised his eyebrows almost imperceptibly. "She chose the one with the lighter balance," he whispered under his breath. "Most people would never notice the difference." Michael heard the remark but refused to acknowledge it. Pride still insisted this performance would end exactly as he predicted. Yet as Emily gently rolled her shoulders, adjusted the cutting board by less than an inch, and wrapped her fingers around the knife with effortless familiarity, the laughter that had filled the restaurant only minutes before faded into complete silence. No one could explain why, but every person watching suddenly felt they were no longer waiting to witness an amateur embarrass herself. They were waiting for something they could not yet understand. The first sound to break the silence was the clean, deliberate rhythm of Emily's knife moving across the cutting board. Every slice through the shallot landed with remarkable consistency, each piece nearly identical in size, reflecting years of disciplined practice rather than hurried instinct. One by one, conversations inside the dining room began to fade. Several guests who had raised their phones expecting an amusing spectacle now found themselves watching her hands instead of their screens. Emily never looked toward the audience. Her attention remained entirely on the ingredients before her. She reached for the sea base and gently ran her fingertips across the skin, checking its texture before patting it dry with careful precision. Then she placed a cast iron skillet over a medium flame without rushing to add butter. Michael observed from only a few feet away with folded arms. "You are already behind the clock," he remarked confidently. Emily nodded politely. "The fish does not know what the clock says," she answered. "It only knows whether the pan is ready." A few cooks exchanged uncertain glances. The response sounded simple, yet strangely difficult to dismiss. Emily hovered her hand briefly above the skillet, before adding a small amount of neutral oil followed by butter. The butter foamed gently without turning brown. Only then did she carefully lower the sea base into the pan. A delicate, even sizzle echoed through the kitchen. The older prep cook quietly leaned toward the young line cook. "Listen to that," he whispered. "No splattering. The temperature is exactly right." The young cook swallowed nervously. He had spent months trying to achieve that same sound consistently. Emily stepped away from the fish without touching it again. She trimmed asparagus with swift, economical movements before placing the stalks into another pan with just enough butter to coat them lightly. Cherry tomatoes followed moments later, blistering gently without collapsing. She selected only 3 basil leaves, rolled them together, and sliced them into impossibly thin ribbons. Nothing she did appeared dramatic. Every movement seemed almost invisible because nothing was wasted. Michael tried to find something to criticize. "You skipped the imported truffles," he said. "Most chefs would use them for a special occasion." Emily continued working calmly. Fresh fish does not need to hide behind expensive ingredients. Several diners looked toward one another. Eleanor Whitman quietly smiled but said nothing. Michael responded with a faint laugh. "That sounds confident." Emily simply replied, "It sounds honest." The words settled into the room with unexpected weight. As the butter sauce slowly came together, Emily removed the skillet from direct heat before whisking in cold butter 1 cube at a time. She never hurried the emulsion. She gently rotated the pan instead of stirring aggressively, allowing the sauce to become smooth, glossy, and perfectly balanced. The aroma drifted beyond the open kitchen almost immediately. Rich butter mingled with bright lemon, fresh herbs, and the natural sweetness of roasted vegetables. Guests instinctively paused in mid-conversation. One elderly woman quietly closed her eyes for a moment before smiling. That reminds me of the little seafood cafe my husband and I found on the Oregon coast years ago, she whispered. Michael noticed the reaction and felt a subtle knot forming inside his chest. Fragrance alone should not have impressed people this deeply. Yet something inside the restaurant had undeniably changed. Even his own brigade had stopped pretending to work while secretly watching. They now stood openly observing every movement Emily made. Not with amusement but with growing respect. She carefully lifted the sea base from the skillet, revealing perfectly crisp golden skin that reflected the warm kitchen lights. Without saying a word, she transferred it onto a resting rack rather than directly onto the plate. The older prep cook slowly shook his head in disbelief. "Someone taught her very well," he murmured. Eleanor Whitman heard the comment and quietly replied without taking her eyes off Emily. Or perhaps she was the one doing the teaching all along. Michael looked toward the food critic, then back at the woman standing calmly beside the stove, and for the first time that evening, doubt spoke louder than pride. Emily allowed the sea base to rest while she gave her full attention to the final details of the plate. She believed that the last 30 seconds of a dish often revealed more about a chef than the first 30 minutes. Every garnish carried intention. Every drop of sauce needed balance. She lifted the pan from the stove and slowly finished the butter sauce with fresh lemon zest, finely chopped herbs, and a final squeeze of citrus added away from direct heat so its brightness would remain alive instead of becoming dull. The glossy sauce reflected the warm lights above like liquid gold. Without measuring spoons or timers, she tasted it once, closed her eyes briefly, and added a single pinch of flaky sea salt. Nothing more. The older prep cook watched in complete silence. "She trusts her palate," he whispered almost to himself. Very few people ever reach that point. Emily arranged the asparagus beside the sea base with natural elegance rather than perfect symmetry. The blistered heirloom tomatoes added gentle color without overwhelming the plate. She spooned the butter sauce carefully beneath the fish instead of pouring it over the crisp skin, preserving both texture and presentation. Finally, she scattered the delicate basil ribbons across the vegetables before wiping the edge of the porcelain plate with a folded towel until it appeared flawless. She stepped back and quietly examined her work. No dramatic flourish followed. No proud smile. She simply nodded once, as though confirming that the ingredients had become exactly what they were meant to be. Michael approached the counter slowly. He searched instinctively for unnecessary decoration, expensive luxury ingredients, or fashionable techniques designed only to impress. Instead, he found remarkable restraint. Every element on the plate served a purpose. Nothing existed merely for appearance. Eleanor Whitman leaned slightly forward from her table. Even from several feet away, she could recognize the quiet confidence reflected in the composition. It reminded her of a style she had encountered years earlier but could not yet place. Michael reached for a tasting fork. The restaurant fell into complete silence. Every member of the kitchen brigade stopped moving. Guests who had been whispering only moments earlier lowered their voices until even the clinking of silverware disappeared. Michael carefully pressed the fork through the crisp skin of the sea base. It cracked gently before revealing perfectly moist flesh beneath. He lifted the first bite to his mouth with the certainty of someone expecting to confirm his own assumptions. Instead, the moment the flavors unfolded, his expression changed almost imperceptibly. The brown butter carried warmth without heaviness. Bright citrus arrived at precisely the right moment. The herbs supported rather than dominated. The fish remained the unmistakable center of every bite. Michael chewed slowly, saying nothing. He tasted another bite. Then another. The room waited. One of the younger cooks finally whispered, "Chef." Michael lowered the fork without answering. He looked down at the plate, then back toward Emily, who stood quietly with her hands gently folded in front of her apron. She showed no impatience, no satisfaction, and no concern. It was the calm expression of someone who had already judged her own work long before anyone else would. Eleanor Whitman slowly rose from her chair and walked toward the tasting counter. "May I?" she asked politely. Michael hesitated for only a brief moment before sliding the plate toward her. She sampled the sea base with practiced concentration, allowing each flavor to settle before lowering the fork. A thoughtful smile appeared across her face. She looked first at Emily, then at Michael, before speaking words that instantly transformed the atmosphere inside the restaurant. "This is not the work of someone who once learned to cook well," she said quietly. "This is the work of someone who spent years teaching excellence itself." The room remained perfectly still, and for the first time that evening, Michael realized the greatest challenge before him was no longer proving that Emily was wrong. It was discovering who she truly was. The words settled over the dining room with extraordinary weight. No one reached for a glass. No one whispered another opinion. Every eye turned toward Emily, who stood exactly where she had been since placing the finished plate on the counter. She neither smiled nor looked surprised by Eleanor Whitman's observation. She simply rested her hands lightly in front of her apron and waited. Chef Michael Prescott searched her face with growing uncertainty. The confidence that had filled his voice throughout the evening had disappeared completely. "What did you mean by that?" he asked Eleanor quietly. The veteran food critic looked from the plate back to Emily before answering. "Some techniques cannot be copied from recipes," she replied. "They come from years of teaching discipline, patience, and restraint. I have tasted food like this only once before." Emily lowered her eyes for a brief moment, saying nothing. Eleanor took another careful bite before placing the fork gently on the plate. "May I ask you a question?" Emily nodded politely. "Of course." Eleanor smiled with quiet respect. 15 years ago, during the American Culinary Masters Invitational in New York, one finalist served a sea bass with a butter sauce that changed the way several judges thought about modern American cuisine. There was one small detail no newspaper ever published. Just before serving the dish, the chef added fresh lemon zest after removing the sauce from the heat because, as she explained to the judges, citrus deserves to stay alive. "Was that your idea?" The room became completely still. Even Michael stopped breathing for a moment. Emily looked at the plate before answering in a voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," she said gently. "Heat should never take away the brightness that nature already gave it." Eleanor slowly closed her eyes and smiled. "I knew it." She turned toward the dining room. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are standing in the presence of the chef who won the Golden Ladle Award at that competition. Emily Carter was one of the youngest champions our judging panel had ever selected." Audible gasps spread across the restaurant. Several guests immediately searched her name on their phones. Within moments, photographs from years earlier appeared across glowing screens. There she was, younger but unmistakably the same woman, standing beside celebrated chefs while holding one of the highest honors in American fine dining. One diner quietly turned his phone toward Michael. The image showed Emily wearing a white chef jacket, accepting the Golden Ladle trophy as flashes from photographers filled the stage. Michael stared at the screen, then looked back at the woman wearing faded jeans and a simple white shirt. The contrast left him speechless. "Why?" he finally managed to ask. "Why did you disappear?" Emily answered without hesitation. "My father became ill. My mother needed help. My family needed someone more than the culinary world, needed another famous chef." Her voice carried neither sadness nor regret. "When they were gone, I stayed with my cousin's farm because honest work still brings me peace." Silence settled over every corner of the restaurant once again. The young line cook who had first listened to Emily's advice slowly lowered his head. He realized he had been learning from someone whose achievements exceeded anything he had imagined. Michael felt memories from culinary school returning with startling clarity. He remembered studying recordings from the American Culinary Masters Invitational. He remembered trying to recreate one particular butter sauce because his instructors had called it an example of perfect balance. He had spent years unknowingly admiring techniques created by the very woman he had invited into his kitchen as a joke. The realization struck with quiet force. He had not challenged an ordinary delivery worker. He had publicly underestimated the chef whose work had inspired part of his own career, and the weight of that truth left him standing in complete silence while the entire restaurant watched pride slowly give way to humility. No one moved. The silence inside the restaurant carried more weight than any applause ever could. Chef Michael Prescott slowly lowered his eyes before looking back at Emily Carter, and for the first time in many years, he found himself without an answer. Every assumption he had made that evening had collapsed beneath the quiet dignity of the woman standing before him. She had never argued. She had never defended herself. She had never once mentioned her accomplishments. Instead, she had allowed her work to reveal the truth. Michael took a slow breath and stepped away from the tasting counter. His polished shoes echoed softly across the marble floor as he walked toward Emily. Every member of his kitchen brigade instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path between them. The guests watched in complete silence. Even Eleanor Whitman remained still, sensing that the most important moment of the evening had nothing to do with food anymore. Michael stopped only a few feet from Emily. His shoulders, once held high with effortless confidence, now reflected genuine humility. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "I owe you far more than an apology for doubting your skill. I owe you an apology for doubting you before you ever touched a knife." Emily met his eyes with the same calm expression she had carried from the moment she entered the restaurant. There was no satisfaction in her face, no triumph, only kindness. Michael continued, his voice steady but noticeably softer than before. "I looked at your clothes before I looked at your character. I saw vegetable crates instead of experience. I saw simplicity instead of excellence. That mistake belongs entirely to me." The room remained perfectly still. Several members of the brigade lowered their heads. They realized they had followed Michael's example without questioning it. The young line cook who had listened to Emily's advice stepped forward. "I did the same thing," he admitted quietly. "I thought you were only making a delivery." Emily offered him a warm smile. "You listened when it mattered," she replied gently. "That is what people remember." Eleanor Whitman closed her notebook and looked around the dining room. "The finest restaurants are not defined by beautiful dining rooms," she said. "They are defined by the humility to keep learning, no matter how successful they become." Her words settled naturally into the silence. Michael slowly removed the embroidered executive chef towel from his shoulder and folded it carefully before placing it on the preparation counter beside Emily. The gesture was simple, yet every chef in the room understood its meaning. It was an act of respect offered from one professional to another. "If you would ever allow it," Michael said sincerely, "I would be honored to learn from you." Emily smiled softly. "We never stop learning from each other," she answered. "That is what makes cooking beautiful." The tension that had filled the restaurant throughout the evening quietly disappeared. Guests who had arrived expecting another unforgettable meal realized they had witnessed something far more meaningful. Several people slowly stood from their tables. One pair of hands began to clap. Another joined. Within seconds the applause spread across the entire dining room. It was not loud or theatrical. It was steady, heartfelt, and filled with genuine admiration. Emily acknowledged the gesture with a simple nod before looking toward the young cooks gathered nearby. "Take care of your ingredients," she said gently. "Take care of the people beside you. If you do those two things well, the recipes will take care of themselves." No one reached for a phone anymore. No one searched for another photograph. They simply listened. And in that quiet restaurant, where pride had once spoken louder than kindness, respect finally became the loudest voice of all. The applause lingered long after Emily Carter quietly untied the borrowed apron and folded it with the same care she had shown every ingredient that evening. She placed it neatly on the counter before lifting the reusable crates that had brought her to the restaurant in the first place. To everyone else they were ordinary wooden boxes filled with herbs and vegetables. To Emily they represented honest work, family, and a life she had chosen freely. Chef Michael Prescott walked beside her toward the front entrance without saying another word for several moments. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt earned. When they reached the glass doors overlooking the softly lit Chicago streets, Michael stopped and faced her once more. "I spent years believing awards, recognition, and reputation proved who I was," he admitted quietly. "Tonight you reminded me that character speaks long before accomplishments ever do." Emily smiled gently. "Success can open doors," she replied. "Only humility allows people to stay inside them." Michael lowered his head with sincere gratitude. "Would you ever consider returning to teach my team?" Emily looked back through the dining room where young cooks still stood watching her with admiration instead of curiosity. She could see possibility in their faces, not because they had witnessed perfection, but because they had witnessed someone choosing kindness over pride. "I would be happy to visit someday," she answered warmly. "But not to teach people how to cook. Recipes change every season. Respect never does." Michael smiled. understanding exactly what she meant. The young line cook hurried forward carrying a small notebook. "Miss Carter," he said almost apologetically, "what is the most important lesson you learned after winning the Golden Ladle Award?" Emily considered the question for a moment before answering. "The trophy stayed on a shelf," she said softly. "The people I loved stayed in my life. That told me which one mattered more." No one spoke after that. The answer was simple enough for everyone to understand. Eleanor Whitman quietly closed her notebook and slipped it into her handbag. "I have reviewed restaurants for more than 3 decades, she said as she approached the entrance. "Most evenings I leave remembering a remarkable meal. Tonight I will remember remarkable people." Emily thanked her with a gracious nod before stepping outside into the cool evening air. A light breeze carried the fresh scent of rain across the quiet street as she loaded the empty crates into the back of her aging pickup truck. There were no cameras waiting outside, no reporters asking questions, and no photographers hoping to capture the famous chef who had quietly returned to ordinary life. Emily preferred it that way. She climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and slowly drove toward the family farm where another sunrise would bring another day of honest work. Behind the restaurant windows, Michael remained standing at the entrance long after the truck disappeared from sight. He looked back toward his kitchen, then toward the brigade of young chefs waiting inside. From that evening forward, every new employee who entered his restaurant heard the same words before touching a single knife. Respect every person before you judge their appearance, because greatness rarely announces itself when it walks through the door. And long after the final plates had been cleared and the dining room lights had grown dim, everyone who had witnessed that unforgettable evening carried home the same quiet truth. The finest ingredient any person can bring into this world is not talent alone, but the humility to recognize greatness before it has to prove itself.